She was supposed to quit by sundown. That was the bet. That was the whole point. Colt Maddox had watched 100 men fold in the Blackstone Range. Broken bones, frostbitten fingers, grown men weeping into the snow and begging to go home. He had buried 3 of them up there, 3 crosses he never visited twice. So when a woman in a wool coat and clean boots stepped off the stage in Silver Ridge and told him she wanted to cross the most dangerous mountain pass in the territory, he laughed. He actually laughed. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like. Stay until the end. You won't regret it. The stage pulled into Silver Ridge at 2:30 on a Thursday, and the town paid it about as much attention as it paid anything else that came down from the Eastern Road, which is to say, almost none. Silver Ridge wasn't the kind of place that got excited about arrivals. It was the kind of place that noticed departures, mostly because departures tended to be permanent. Men came to Silver Ridge chasing silver and left broke, frostbitten, or horizontal in a pine box. The mountains didn't care about ambition. They didn't care about anything. Colt Maddox was sitting outside Harlan's general store when the stage rolled in, his boots propped up on a barrel, a half-eaten strip of jerky hanging from the corner of his mouth. He wasn't watching the stage out of curiosity. He was watching it because there was nothing else to look at, and a man needed somewhere to rest his eyes. The door swung open and a woman stepped down. She was not what Silver Ridge produced. Silver Ridge produced leathered skin and broken nails and eyes that had stopped hoping for things they weren't going to get. This woman had color in her cheeks that hadn't been put there by cold or labor. Her coat was wool, charcoal gray, city cut, with brass buttons that caught the thin winter light. Her boots were clean. Her hair was pinned up under a hat that probably cost more than Colt made in a week. She looked around Silver Ridge the way people looked at something they'd expected to be worse, and found it was, in fact, exactly as bad as they'd feared. Colt pulled the jerky from his mouth and watched her. She had a leather document case tucked under one arm and a traveling bag in the other hand. No porter, no companion, no husband hovering 2 steps behind, just her, standing in the frozen mud of Silver Ridge's main street like she'd arrived at the wrong address and was deciding whether to make the best of it. He figured she'd ask for the hotel, get one look at what passed for a hotel in Silver Ridge, and climb back on the stage at first opportunity. He figured wrong, Oki. She walked directly to Harlan's, which told him she'd done some asking before she got here. You didn't walk directly to anything in Silver Ridge unless someone had already told you where it was. The town wasn't laid out so much as it had accumulated. Buildings dropped where men had decided to stop walking, roads worn into the dirt by repetition rather than planning. The bell above the door jangled. Colt didn't move from his barrel. He heard her voice through the wall, clear, precise. Not Boston exactly. He'd been to Boston once, back when he was young and stupid enough to think cities had something to offer him, but close. East Coast money. The kind of voice that had been educated into confidence and never quite lost it. I'm looking for a guide, she said. A man named Maddox. Colt Maddox. I was told he works out of this establishment. He heard Harlan's pause, the old man's famous 3-second hesitation before he said anything that might get him into trouble. He's around. Does that mean he's here? Another pause. It means he's around. Colt stood up, not because he particularly wanted to deal with whoever this was, but because his back had started aching from the barrel, and the conversation through the wall was more interesting than the mud street. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. She turned immediately. Not startled, just responsive. Her eyes found him the way a person's eyes found something they'd been looking for. She looked him up and down once, not rudely, but efficiently, like she was checking a list. He did the same. Up close, she was younger than he'd estimated. Mid-20s, maybe. Her face had that particular quality of someone who'd been pretty long enough that they'd stopped thinking about it and moved on to other concerns. Her eyes were dark brown and extremely steady. Mr. Maddox, she said. Not a question. Depends on who's asking. My name is Evelyn Mercer. She set her traveling bag down on Harlan's counter and extended her hand. My father was Edmund Mercer. He filed a silver claim in the Blackstone Range 18 years ago. He died 4 months ago without ever working it. I need someone to guide me to that claim before a man named Victor Blackwell's lawyers finish burying it in paperwork and it disappears forever. Colt looked at her hand for a moment. He shook it. Her grip was firm. He noticed that. "I know the Blackstone Range," he said. "I know you do. You're considered the best guide working out of this region, possibly the best in the territory." People say a lot of things. People also say you're expensive, difficult, and that you've turned down more jobs than you've taken in the last 2 years. She reached into her document case and pulled out an envelope. She set it on the counter between them. "I'm prepared to offer you $2,000. Half now, half when we reach the claim." The store went quiet. Even Harlan, who was pretending to organize a shelf of tins he'd already organized that morning, went still. $2,000 was not a small number. $2,000 was the kind of number that made a man do math he hadn't intended to do. Colt looked at the envelope. He looked at her. He thought about the Blackstone Range in January, the wind that came off the upper ridges like a physical blow, the ice that formed on the trail faces overnight and turned a path you'd walked 100 times into a killing slope, the cold that got inside your lungs and stayed there. He thought about a woman in a clean wool coat and city boots. "You know what time of year it is?" he said. "January. You know what January means up there. I'm aware it will be challenging." Challenging. He repeated the word the way you'd repeat a word said in the wrong language. "Lady, I've seen experienced men who've worked mountains their whole lives, curl up and die in the Blackstone Range in January. The cold alone will reach 40 below some nights. The upper trails are solid ice. There are passes where one wrong step puts you off a cliff you won't stop falling down for 200 feet. I understand the risks. With respect, ma'am, I don't think you do." Her chin came up slightly. It wasn't defiant exactly. It was the movement of someone who'd heard some version of this speech before and had decided to let it finish before responding. "Mr. Maddox," she said, "my father spent the last years of his life trying to protect that claim. He believed in it completely. When he died, I found his documents, his surveys, his maps, everything. Victor Blackwell's people are already filing competing claims based on altered boundary records. I have maybe 3 months before those filings are complete, and the courts side with Blackwell because he has more lawyers than my father had dollars. The only way I can stop that is to physically reach that mine, document what I find there, and bring back evidence that the original claim is legitimate and active." She paused. "I'm not asking you to believe in me. I'm asking you to take my money and do your job." Colt studied her for a long moment. The thing was, he'd already made his decision. He'd made it about 30 seconds into this conversation, the moment he heard $2,000. The money was real. The job was technically possible, hard, brutal, and miserable, but possible for someone who knew those mountains the way he did. And he'd already decided, with a certainty he wasn't proud of, but didn't bother fighting, that she would quit. They always quit. The ones who came in from the city with their clean clothes and their firm handshakes and their speeches about determination, they always, without exception, hit the first real wall of the mountain and discovered that determination was a feeling you had in warm rooms, not a physical substance you could spend when your body was shutting down and the trail was invisible under 3 feet of fresh snow. She'd quit. He'd keep the $1,000. And he'd have earned it for the trouble of turning around and walking back. He picked up the envelope. "We leave at first light," he said. "I'll give you a supply list tonight. Everything on it, no substitutions. You show up tomorrow with anything missing, we don't go." "Understood." "And we go at my pace, on my route, by my rules. You argue with me up there, the deal's off, and you find your own way home." "Agreed. One more thing." He held up the envelope. "The other 1,000 when we reach the claim. Not before. Not almost there. Not close enough. The claim." Something moved behind her eyes, not hesitation. She'd already decided, just a quick weighing of conditions against necessity. "Agreed," she said again. Harlan exhaled loudly from the direction of his tin shelf. Both of them ignored him. He gave her the supply list that evening at the boarding house. He'd made it thorough. Wool underlayers, heavy gloves, crampons for the ice, a proper pack frame, emergency rations for 12 days, a bedroll rated for extreme cold. The kind of gear that cost real money and took most of a day to assemble, even if the town's general store had all of it, which Silver Ridges did not quite. He fully expected her to come back in the morning with half the list and an excuse. She showed up at dawn with everything on it. Not just everything. She'd sourced a better quality of cold weather boot than he'd specified, which told him she'd asked someone for advice, probably Harlan, who in a rare moment of genuine usefulness had apparently directed her toward the trapper's supply that operated out of a shed behind the livery. She had a medical kit that was more comprehensive than anything he carried himself. She had maps, her father's original survey maps, laminated in some kind of waxed cloth to protect them from moisture. She stood in front of him in the gray pre-dawn with her pack on and her breath fogging in the air, and she looked at him with those steady brown eyes and said, "Ready when you are." He shouldered his own pack without a word and started walking. The first hour on the trail was always the honest one, before the mountain started asking real questions, before the cold worked its way through whatever you were wearing, before the grade began to seriously punish your knees and lungs. The first hour was just walking, a test of pace, of how a person held themselves, of whether they were going to spend the whole time talking. Evelyn Mercer walked well. He noticed that within 20 minutes and filed it away without quite letting it change anything. Good stride, natural rhythm, no wasted movement. She kept up without being told to, without audible effort, without commentary. She also did not talk much, which was its own kind of mercy. He'd guided talkative clients before. The worst were the ones who kept up a steady stream of nervous observation. "Oh, look at that tree. Is that a hawk? How much further? Are those clouds a concern?" As if the silence of the mountain was something to be papered over. She watched the terrain. She watched his feet and matched his line through the switchbacks. When the trail narrowed to single file, she dropped back without being asked. When they crossed the first iced-over section, a 40-foot stretch where a thin melt had refrozen overnight into something the color and texture of old glass, she stopped, looked at it, pulled out her crampons, strapped them on efficiently, and walked across without a word. He watched her from the other side. He didn't say anything either, but he moved the schedule in his head. He'd planned to make her feel the pace today, push it just enough that by evening she'd be too spent to complain and too tired to do anything but collapse into her bedroll and question her choices. He didn't adjust the pace, but he stopped thinking of her as already quit. By midday they'd gained 2,000 feet. The air had changed, thinner, colder, with that particular bite that lived above the tree line where the wind had nothing to slow it down. The trail had narrowed from a decent path to something that required attention, picking between rocks and frozen soil, reading the grade. They stopped at a shelf of rock that offered a view back toward the valley. Silver Ridge was a brown smudge in the white distance. The sky above the western ridges had a yellowish cast that Colt watched for a moment with professional interest. Evelyn ate without sitting down, standing at the edge of the rock shelf, looking out. She had a piece of hard bread and some dried meat from her pack. She ate methodically, looking at her father's map between bites, tracing something with one gloved finger. "The survey puts the claim at the eastern face of what he called Mercer's Peak," she said without preamble, "though I don't know if that's a name anyone else uses." Colt looked at her map. "People call it Widow's Cap, the peak that hooks north." She found it on the map. "Yes, that matches. She studied it for another moment. "He wrote that the vein ran northeast to southwest at roughly 30 degrees. He estimated it at something in the range of—" She stopped. "You don't need the details." "Not particularly. I was going to say several $100,000, but it seemed like something I shouldn't say out loud up here." He looked at her. "Because you think someone might be listening?" "Because it sounds insane when I say it out loud, and I'm still not entirely sure I'm not chasing a dead man's dream." She folded the map. "My father was a practical man. He wasn't given to fantasy, but he also spent 18 years never going back to actually work that claim, and that's the part I can't make sense of." Colt watched the yellowish sky. "What do you think stopped him?" "Money, at first. He didn't have the capital to develop a full mining operation. Then he had a partner who backed out. Then he was ill for 2 years. Then—" She stopped. "Then Blackwell's people started making noise about the boundary records, and my father spent the last 4 years trying to fight that legally instead of just going back to document the claim physically." "Should have just gone back." "Yes," she said simply. "He should have. But he didn't, and now I have to." The wind picked up off the ridge above them. She pulled her collar higher without breaking eye contact with the map. He noticed her hands had a slight tremor from the cold, but her movements were controlled. "We need to move," he said. "I know." She put the map away. "I was waiting for you to say so." He started up the trail without telling her if she was doing well or badly, because he hadn't decided yet, and he didn't say things he hadn't decided. The afternoon went harder. He took them up a route that crossed a boulder field, loose, frost-heaved rocks that shifted under weight in unpredictable ways, no two steps the same. The kind of terrain that would ruin your ankles if you let your concentration drift. Standard clients hated this section. They complained, they went slow, they grabbed at him for support, they sometimes sat down on a rock and refused to go further until he found a gentler line. Evelyn picked her way through it without complaint. She was slower than him. He was faster than most people on this terrain because he'd crossed it enough times that his feet made the right decisions without waiting for his brain. But she was careful and methodical, and she didn't fall. She fell once. She was reaching for a handhold on a waist-high boulder when her right boot found ice beneath the rock dust and slipped. She went down hard on her left knee. The sound of impact was bad, the kind of solid crack that made a man wince. Colt turned. She was already getting up. Her jaw was set. Her knee was bleeding through her trousers. He could see the dark stain spreading from the torn fabric. She put weight on it, tested it, looked up, and saw him watching. "I'm fine," she said. "You're bleeding." "I know." She started walking again. "It's a scrape." It was more than a scrape, but she wasn't limping badly and her movement was clean, so he let it go. He did slow the pace by about 10% without saying that was what he was doing. She either didn't notice or chose not to mention it. That evening, they made camp on a protected ledge below the first real ridgeline. Colt built a fire. There was still enough scrub wood at this elevation to make it worth doing, and they cooked without ceremony, a tin pot of beans and salt pork between them, something hot to hold against the dropping temperature. The thermometer on his pack read 12 degrees. By midnight, it would be below zero. She'd taken off her boot and was dealing with her knee in the firelight. He watched without watching. The way you watch things in the mountains when you needed to know the state of your situation without making a conversation of it. The cut was about 2 inches long and had stopped bleeding, but the knee itself was swelling. She cleaned it, applied something from her medical kit, wrapped it with a bandage that was neater than he'd expected. "You've done that before," he said. "My father kept horses. Horses get cuts constantly. You learn to clean a wound." She pulled her trouser leg down. "I'll be able to walk tomorrow." "I know." She looked at him. "You didn't ask." "You'd have told me if you couldn't." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite surprise, but an adjustment of some prior expectation. She looked back at the fire. "Yes, I would have." They didn't talk much after that. The cold came in, and they pulled their bedrolls close to the dying fire, and he lay there in the dark listening to the mountain's particular nighttime vocabulary. The settling of frost, the distant groan of shifting snow, the nothing sound of absolute stillness between wind gusts. And thought about $2,000. He thought about the woman on the other side of the fire, who had walked all day through serious terrain, fallen once and gotten up without theater, cleaned her own wound without asking for sympathy, and eaten camp beans in 12-degree cold without saying a single word about it. She was going to quit, he told himself, tomorrow or the day after. The real tests hadn't started yet. He went to sleep with the specific, particular confidence of a man who is right about almost everything and hasn't yet encountered the thing that will prove otherwise. Day 2 started at 30 below on the ridge. It was the kind of cold that stopped being a temperature and became something else. A presence, a pressure, a constant renegotiation between your body and the world about what warmth meant and whether you deserved any of it. The wind was coming from the northwest, straight off the high country, and it moved fast and it had nothing apologetic about it. Evelyn was up before him. He opened his eyes and found her already packed, the fire rebuilt from the last of the scrub wood, a pot of coffee on the flame. She handed him a tin cup without speaking. He drank it standing up. The coffee was terrible. She'd used too much grounds and not enough time. But it was hot, and hot was the only quality that mattered at 30 below. "Your knee," he said. "Stiff." "Better once I'm moving." She kicked the fire apart and started covering the coals with snow. "Is the ridge crossing today?" "Second half of today." "And the other side?" "Worse." "Of course." She shouldered her pack. "Ready." The ridge crossing was the kind of thing that ended ambitions. Colt had watched it end more than he could count. The trail across the top of the first major spine was not technically difficult. It wasn't a climbing route, wasn't vertical, didn't require equipment beyond crampons and nerve, but it was exposed in a way that few non-mountain people had experienced. The drop on the western side was somewhere around 800 feet of near vertical cliff. The drop on the eastern side was more gradual, but still plenty fatal. The trail between was sometimes 4 feet wide and sometimes 2, and the wind at the top ran 40 miles an hour on a calm day. Today was not a calm day. He turned to her at the bottom of the approach. "Wind's going to be bad up there. You don't lean into it, you brace against it. You lose your footing, you drop and grab. Don't try to stay upright, it's worse. You keep your pack weight centered. If I stop, you stop. If I change direction, you change direction. Don't ask questions while we're moving." She was looking up at the ridge with an expression he'd learned to read in clients over the years. It was the expression of someone who had understood intellectually that something would be hard and was now recalibrating that understanding in light of the physical reality. "Okay," she said. "Not I understand or I can do this or any of the things people said when they were performing bravery. Just okay." Like a note taken, they started up. The wind hit them at full force about 60 feet below the crest. It wasn't a gust. It was a wall, steady and enormous, coming from the northwest like it had been building speed since Canada and had chosen this ridge to demonstrate what it had accumulated. Colt leaned into it automatically, his body adjusting from years of practice. He heard Evelyn stumble behind him. Not fall. Stumble, a catch step, a recovery. He didn't look back. Looking back on this section was a mistake. You looked forward, you watched your footing, and you trusted that the person behind you was either keeping up or they weren't. She kept up. It took 22 minutes to cross the ridge. He knew because he counted, the way he always counted on sections where the math of time and endurance was something he needed to track. 22 minutes of wind so cold it made his eyes water behind his goggles, a footing that required full attention every second, of a drop on both sides that his body hadn't entirely stopped noticing even after all these years. When they came off the far side and dropped below the wind line, the silence hit like a different kind of blow. His ears rang. He turned. Evelyn was 3 steps behind him. Her face was red from the cold, her goggles fogged at the edges, her breathing hard but controlled. She had a small cut on her chin where the wind had driven a piece of ice or grit against her skin. She didn't touch it. She looked at him for a moment. "That's the worst it gets?" she asked. He thought about the passes above Widow's Cap. He thought about the ice fields on the eastern approach. He thought about the traverse she'd have to do if the main trail was blocked, which in January it often was. "No," he said honestly. She nodded like this was information she was filing for later, not a thing that frightened her. "Then let's keep moving," she said. That night, camped in a hollow below the eastern descent, he sat up later than usual, tending the fire longer than he needed to. Across from him, she was already asleep, had been within minutes of lying down, which was either the sleep of the genuinely exhausted or the genuinely unbothered. He watched the fire and did not let himself think too carefully about the fact that his certainty about her quitting had not exactly grown stronger over the past 2 days. She'd fallen once and gotten up. She'd crossed the ridge without freezing. She'd walked on a swollen knee for 8 hours without mentioning it more than twice. She'd eaten bad camp food in temperatures that should have made eating feel like punishment and hadn't complained about any of it. This was not what he'd expected. What he'd expected was what he always got from city people: the initial bravado, the careful management of appearance, and then, at the first genuinely hard thing, the reveal. The moment when the version of themselves they'd presented turned out to be the wishful one. She kept not having a moment like that. He poked the fire. A log shifted and sparks rose into the black air. The thing was, he'd made the journey hard on purpose. Not dangerously hard. He wasn't going to risk his own life for a point, but harder than it needed to be. The boulder field today had been avoidable. There was a longer route around it that was gentler on the joints, that he used with older clients or people who were struggling. He'd taken the direct line through because he'd been testing something. He was still testing something. He wasn't ready to say the test had produced unexpected results. He was just noting the data. Tomorrow they'd hit the second ridge, and the day after that, the upper glacier approach to Widow's Cap. And if she was still standing after those, well, he'd figure out what that meant when he got there. He put out the fire and lay down in the dark and thought about $2,000 and the way she'd said okay at the bottom of the ridge approach and the way her grip had felt when they shook hands. Firm, like a person who meant what they were saying and wasn't asking him to make allowances for it. He fell asleep before he'd finished deciding what to make of any of it. Above them, in the darkness over the Blackstone Range, the weather was doing something that neither of them knew about yet. A front was building over the high country, not the regular winter cold, not the ordinary pattern of wind and temperature that January always carried. Something bigger. A pressure system that had been consolidating for days over the empty peaks northwest of the territory, pulling moisture and cold together into a configuration that the old-timers in Silver Ridge, the ones who'd been reading mountain weather for 30 years, would have recognized if they'd been watching the sky that evening. They weren't watching. Neither was Colt. Neither was Evelyn. The mountain was keeping its own counsel, the way mountains did. Patient, absolute. Indifferent to bets and Boston heiresses and the specific pride of men who believed they knew it well enough to use it as a tool. The front moved closer in the dark, and the stars above the Blackstone Range were very bright and very cold, and in the hollow below the eastern descent, 2 people slept without knowing what was coming for them. The third morning arrived without sunrise. That was the first sign, though Colt didn't name it as such right away. The sky above the eastern ridgeline simply failed to do what it usually did. That slow bleed of gray into pale gold that told you the world was still operating on schedule. Instead, it stayed the color of old pewter, flat and sealed, like something had been laid across it overnight. The wind that usually picked up at dawn was absent. The air was completely still, and that stillness had a weight to it that Colt had felt before and didn't particularly enjoy feeling again. He stood outside their camp for a long moment, looking at the sky, reading it the way he'd been reading mountain skies for 20 years. He didn't like what it said. He broke camp faster than usual without explaining why, and Evelyn, to her credit, matched his pace without asking questions. She'd learned that much in 2 days, that when he moved with a certain kind of efficiency, it was not the time to stand around inquiring about the reasoning. She packed her bedroll in under 4 minutes, which was better than some men he'd guided. They were moving by the time the first light should have appeared and didn't. The trail on day 3 took them through what Colt privately called the corridor, a long, narrow valley hemmed in on both sides by cliffs that funneled the wind into something organized and purposeful. In summer, it was merely unpleasant. In January, it was an education in how specifically cold air could target the gaps in whatever you were wearing. The kind of cold that found the half-inch of exposed wrist between your glove and your sleeve and concentrated itself there until you couldn't feel your hand. Evelyn didn't complain about the corridor. She did stop twice to adjust her layering, once pulling a second pair of gloves over the first, once tucking a wool wrap more firmly around her neck, but these were practical adjustments made in motion, not stops. She'd figured out that the cold was a problem to be solved, not protested. He was watching her more than he'd intended to. The thing that was starting to unsettle him, not in a dramatic way, just in the quiet way of a man whose expectations are being rearranged without his permission, was the absence of performance. Most clients performed. They performed toughness or humor or determination or cheerfulness, depending on their personality. They had a face they put on for the mountain, and it was always slightly separate from whatever face they wore when they thought no one was watching. Evelyn's face when she thought no one was watching looked exactly the same as her face when she knew he was looking. Tired, focused, present. Sometimes she set her jaw against something. The cold, the grade, the ache in her knee, which he could see in her gait even when she was trying to hide it. But she didn't rearrange her expression when she noticed him noticing. That was unusual. He wasn't sure yet whether it meant something or whether he was looking for patterns in things that didn't have them. They stopped at midday on a shelf that offered some protection from the absent wind. Absent in a way that had gone from notable to concerning, that held stillness that wasn't peaceful but anticipatory. He heated water on his small camp stove and made something that could generously be called broth, and they stood with their cups and looked at the sky, which had gone from pewter to a yellow-gray that he associated with very specific and very bad outcomes. "That sky is wrong," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "When did you learn to read mountain weather?" "I don't know mountain weather. I know when a sky looks wrong." She was still looking up at it, her cup held in both hands. My father described a storm he got caught in up here once. He said the sky turned the color of a bruise before it hit. Colt thought about the front he'd been tracking all morning through signs and pressure and instinct and 20 years of pattern recognition. He thought about what was above them and what was behind them and the math of distance and days. "How far to the next shelter point?" she asked. 8 miles if we push. And if we don't push? We don't make it before whatever that is arrives. She drank the last of her broth. Then we push. He appreciated that she didn't dress it up. He put out the stove and they started moving, and he set a pace that was honest about what he was asking of both of them. The next 4 hours were the hardest she'd faced. The trail out of the corridor climbed sharply, 1,000 feet of serious grade on a path that demanded full attention and full physical commitment. Every step was a negotiation between gravity and grip. Her pack, 30-some pounds of gear and supplies, turned from something she carried into something that was trying to pull her backward down the mountain. She didn't fall again. She came close, twice, places where the trail crumbled slightly underfoot and her weight shifted wrong. And both times she caught herself with a kind of stubborn physical resourcefulness that he'd only seen in people who'd been pushed past what they thought they were capable of and discovered something on the other side. You couldn't fake that quality. You couldn't bring it with you from civilization. The mountain produced it, or it wasn't there. But the sky was getting worse. By the time they came out on the upper traverse above the corridor, the yellow-gray had deepened into something almost green at the edges, and the wind had returned. Not the corridor's channeled gust, but something broader and lower-pitched. The kind of wind that was more of a weather system announcing itself than weather happening. He could feel the pressure change in his ears. "Colt," he turned. She was pointing northeast. Above the ridgeline, maybe 8 miles out, the sky had gone the color of iron. Not dark exactly, a particular flat brightness that was somehow worse than darkness. He'd seen that specific color twice in his life on mountains, and both times he'd been running from it within minutes. "Move," he said. "Now, don't stop unless I stop." She didn't ask why. She started moving. He pushed them hard. Harder than he'd pushed her in 3 days, which meant harder than he'd pushed most clients ever. The trail dropped off the upper traverse and wound through a boulder field, a different one from the first day, larger and less stable. And he took it at a pace that was close to reckless, because reckless was now the correct calculation. Getting caught in the open on this terrain by what was coming was worse than a twisted ankle. Considerably worse. She kept up. He heard her breathing, hard, working, the sound of someone at or near their limit, but she kept up. The wind was fully up now, and it was cold in a way that was beyond temperature. That particular assault the mountain reserved for moments when it had decided to be serious. Ice crystals were coming horizontally off the upper ridges. Not snow yet, but the advanced material, the thing that came before. The shelter was a line shack that an old mining outfit had built 40 years ago and abandoned. One room, solid stone walls, a rusted stove that worked when you convinced it to. It sat at the edge of a protected hollow, a quarter-mile below the eastern approach to the second ridge. Colt had used it twice before. He'd considered it a useful thing to know about, but never a critical one. He was reconsidering that now. They reached it with maybe 30 minutes to spare. He knew this because when he got the door open and pushed them both inside. The first real snow hit the roof within the time it took him to get the stove lit. And this was not gentle introductory snow. This was a full white wall of it, the kind that went from nothing to everywhere, without the courtesy of a gradual progression. Evelyn stood in the middle of the small room with her pack still on her back, and her chest heaving and ice crystals in her hair, and she looked at the wall of white through the one small window and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she said, "That was close." "Yes," he agreed. "How long will it last?" "Don't know. A day. Maybe 2. He got the stove going. The old cast iron protested and smoked and then decided to cooperate. And the first thin warmth began to move into the room. Maybe more. She pulled off her pack, set it down, sat on the single wooden bench that ran along one wall. She put her head back against the stone and closed her eyes, and for about 20 seconds she looked exactly like a person who had used up a significant portion of what they had. Then she opened her eyes and reached for her pack's front pocket and pulled out her father's maps. He watched her unfold them on the bench beside her,
smoothing the waxed cloth with one hand, orienting herself by studying the contour lines with the focused attention of someone learning a language by immersion. "We're about here," she said, pointing.
He crossed the room and looked. "Closer to here." He moved her finger slightly southwest. "The line shack doesn't show on those maps. Too recent." "How far to Widow's Cap from this point?" 4 days in good conditions. With this storm," he looked at the window where the snow was accumulating against the glass. "Hard to say. Could be more." "And Blackwell's people." She said it carefully, not as a question. "Do they know about this approach?" "Depends on who they hired." He looked at her. "You think they're already up here?" "I think they have more resources than I do, and more reason to move fast." She refolded the map with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. "My father's lawyer received a legal notice 3 weeks ago. Blackwell's filing is nearly complete. If they can claim the mine is abandoned and unclaimed, which they'll argue it is since my father hasn't physically visited it in years, then the boundary dispute goes away and they get everything. And if you get there first, if I get there first with documentation, photographs, samples, my father's original survey markers if they're still standing, then I can prove continuous intent to develop. It's a legal standard. Continuous intent. It means you didn't just file and forget." Colt sat down on the opposite end of the bench. The stove was doing better now, pushing heat into the corners, and the roar of the storm outside had settled into a constant battering that was noise enough to fill the silence. "Your father never went back," he said. "In 18 years?" "No." "So how do you argue continuous intent?" "Because he never stopped trying to get there. He documented everything, every attempt, every obstacle, every legal filing, every piece of correspondence with surveyors and lawyers. There are 12 years of letters in his desk about nothing but that claim." She paused. "He spent the last 2 years of his life fighting Blackwell's initial challenges in court instead of going to the mountain. His lawyers told him the legal route was safer. The legal route lost him time." "Yes, and now you're running out of it." She looked at him steadily. "Which is why I hired the best guide in the territory and agreed to cross a mountain in January." The fire popped. Outside, the storm redoubled for a moment, a gust that made the stone walls vibrate in a way that reminded Colt of what walls were for. He'd been thinking over the past 3 days, in the half-conscious way he did most of his thinking, about what he actually knew of Victor Blackwell. He knew the name the way anyone in the territory knew it, attached to deals that went his way and men who had stood against him and then stopped standing. He knew Blackwell had operations in 3 mountain counties and interests in the rail lines that served them and the politicians who oversaw them. He knew that 2 years ago, a competing mine operator named Farrell had challenged one of Blackwell's boundary filings and been found in a ravine outside of town, which the coroner had officially called an accident in a way that satisfied no one but closed the books. He hadn't thought about any of this carefully when he'd taken Evelyn's money. He'd been thinking about a city woman who would quit by the second day and $1,000 he'd keep for the trouble. "This Blackwell," he said, "you know what he does to people who get in his way?" Something shifted in her expression, but she held it. "Yes." "Then you know coming up here alone, even with a guide, is dangerous." "Yes, I know." Her voice was flat, not frightened. "I've been threatened twice since my father's will was read. Someone went through my hotel room in Denver and took copies of the survey documents. My lawyer received an unsigned letter advising him to withdraw from the case." She paused. "None of those things made me stop. The mountain is dangerous. The men Blackwell employs are dangerous. I know that." She looked at him with those steady brown eyes. "Did you take my money thinking this was going to be simple?" "I took your money thinking you'd quit before any of it mattered." He said it straight out because there wasn't a point in pretending otherwise at this stage. He watched her face absorb it. She was quiet for a moment. "And now?" she asked. He looked at the window, at the storm pressing itself against the glass, at the darkness that was coming early because of the cloud cover, giving the small room a particular quality of isolation that made it feel farther from the rest of the world than the miles could account for. "Now I think you're not going to quit," he said, "which changes the situation somewhat." "How?" "Because if you make it to that claim, Blackwell's not going to accept a legal loss gracefully. He's going to send people, and his people on a mountain are more dangerous than his people in a courthouse." "I know." I'm not sure you know what I mean by, I mean, I know, she said, with a quietness that was heavier than volume would have been. I've thought about this. I've thought about almost nothing else for 4 months. I know what Blackwell does. I know what getting there first means. I know that even with evidence, even with documentation, this doesn't end in a courtroom where everyone behaves politely. She folded her hands in her lap. My father was afraid of exactly that. I think it's why he kept finding reasons not to go. He was afraid of what the mountain version of this fight would look like. Colt was quiet. The fire worked. And you're not afraid? He said. I didn't say that. Her chin came up slightly. I said, I'm going anyway. He sat with that for a while. Outside, the storm tore at the mountain with the thoroughness of something that had been patient and was done being patient. The walls held. The stove produced its unsteady warmth. He thought about a woman who'd walked 3 days of serious mountain terrain on a cut knee without asking for more than what she needed. He thought about the envelope with the $1,000, which was in his inside pocket, which he had been, if he was honest, not thinking about very much for the past 2 days because other things had been more immediately relevant. He was still thinking about it when she fell asleep again. Upright first, her head drooping, then a sideways slide until she was horizontal on the bench, with her coat pulled up and her arm under her head for a pillow, with that same quick exit into unconsciousness that he'd noticed the first night. As if her body simply said enough when the conditions permitted it and didn't wait for permission. He kept the stove going. He checked the door. The storm had piled 18 inches of snow against it already, and it was still building, and calculated what they had for supplies against how long they might be pinned. 3 days on emergency rations if they were careful. 4 if they were very careful. He sat back down and looked at his hands, which had done 20 years of mountain work and showed it, and thought about the fact that he was now in a different kind of situation than the one he'd agreed to. Not the storm, not the shelter. Those were problems with solutions, logistical problems that mountain experience handled. The other thing, the Blackwell thing. The part where getting this woman to her father's mine was no longer just a matter of terrain and endurance, but potentially a matter of what happened after, who was waiting there, what they were willing to do about losing. He hadn't signed up for that. He'd signed up for a straightforward guide job, the kind he could do with his eyes half closed, the kind that was supposed to end with a city woman turning around on day 2, and the whole thing being a profitable and mildly amusing waste of a week. He looked at her sleeping on the bench, at her father's maps, folded in the pocket of her coat, at the cut on her chin that had scabbed over cleanly, and the wrapped knee and the callous spots that were starting to form on her palms from the pack straps. He thought about the Farrell case, the ravine, the coroner's report that satisfied no one. The storm screamed against the north wall. Snow was coming through the gap under the door now, a thin white line of it advancing across the stone floor. He stuffed a rolled blanket against the gap. He sat back down. He looked at the fire. He didn't make any decisions, or at least he didn't make anything he was going to call a decision. He just stayed awake while she slept and let the storm be what it was outside, and the warmth be what it was inside, and the territory between those two conditions be something he was still, slowly, working out. Above them on the mountain, beyond the shelter's small circle of light and heat, the storm was doing something no one had predicted in terms of its scale or its duration. The pressure system that had been building northwest of the territory for days had finally committed to what it wanted to be, and what it wanted to be was catastrophic. By morning, the upper ridges would be buried under 4 feet of new snow. The main trail, the one Colt had taken them away from when he pushed for the shelter, would be completely impassable, not for days, but for the better part of a week. The whole eastern approach to the second ridge would be restructured by the avalanche conditions that a load like this created on any slope above 30 degrees. And on the northeast face of Widow's Cap, where a rock formation sat at the edge of a steep couloir, a slab of snow the size of a small house was hanging in the particular unstable way that preceded a very specific kind of catastrophe. Neither of them knew about any of this yet. They knew about the fire, and the bench, and the storm outside, and the distance still remaining, and their own particular private calculations about what each of those things meant. The fire burned down toward its coals, and the mountain did what mountains did, and morning was still a long way off. The storm broke on the second day, the way bad things sometimes end, not gradually, not with the courtesy of a slow fade, but with an abruptness that felt almost insulting given what it had put them through. 1 hour the wind was tearing at the roof of the line shack, hard enough to make the stovepipe rattle in its bracket. The next, silence dropped over the mountain like a cloth thrown over a lamp. Colt was already awake when it happened. He'd been awake for most of both nights, keeping the fire, rationing the wood they'd found stacked against the interior wall, enough barely, if he was careful, and doing the kind of thinking that long nights in small rooms with bad weather outside tended to produce. He opened the door into 2.5 feet of snow packed against the threshold, and a sky that was the specific blue of extreme cold and recent violence. Everything was buried. The boulder field south of the hollow had become a white plain. The trail they'd come in on was completely invisible. Evelyn appeared at his shoulder, looking out. "That's a lot of snow," she said. "Yes." "How do we move through it?" "Carefully." He looked at the sky, reading the pressure, reading the temperature, reading the particular quality of light that told him whether the slope above them had stabilized or whether the new load was still settling. "The upper ridge is going to be unstable. We go wide on the approach, come in from the southeast instead of direct." "How much time does that add?" "Day and a half, maybe 2. She absorbed this. "And the timeline with Blackwell's filing?" "I know." He pulled on his gloves. "Get your pack. We move in 30 minutes. They moved in 25. The first 2 hours out of the shelter were genuinely brutal. Post-storm travel through deep, unconsolidated snow that swallowed your leg to the knee with every step, that turned a 1/4 mile of trail into an hour of exhausting labor. He broke trail and she followed in his footsteps, which was the only sensible approach. But even in his footsteps, the snow was deep enough to make each step a full-body effort. She didn't say anything about it. She worked. The sound of her breathing behind him was hard and steady. Not the gasping of someone at their limit, but the controlled labor of someone managing a limit they'd already found and decided to operate at anyway. He found himself listening for it the way he'd started listening for it on day 1, using it as an instrument the way you used a barometer, checking the reading. By midday, the snow had compacted enough to support their weight without snowshoes, and the travel got easier, and they made up some of the time he'd lost to the detour. The mountain around them was transformed, every familiar landmark buried or reshaped, the world reduced to white, and the particular blue shadow that snow made on itself under a clear sky. He was picking their line up toward the eastern approach of the second ridge, the wide southeastern sweep that avoided the unstable upper couloirs. When he heard it, he stopped. It was a sound he knew the way he knew his own name. A deep, resonant crack, like something structural giving way, followed by a building roar that started at the edge of hearing and grew with a speed that compressed your sense of time. He turned. The north face of the ridge above them was moving. Not a small slide. The whole upper slab, maybe 300 feet across, the new snow and the old ice beneath it releasing together in the particular catastrophic way that a 2-day storm load on a previously stressed slope sometimes produced. White and gray, and the dark flash of exposed rock tumbling together, coming down the chute to the northeast of their position with a sound that was no longer just sound but pressure, the kind that hit your chest from the inside.
"Run," he said. "That way. Southeast, along the ridge base. Move." She was already moving. She didn't ask which way southeast was. She picked it from the orientation of the slide, and she ran, pack and all, through snow that was still knee-deep in the low spots, with a speed he hadn't seen from her before and wouldn't have predicted. He ran behind her, calculating. The slide's main track was northeast of them. They weren't in the direct path, but the debris field would spread. The question was how far. He got his answer about 40 seconds later when the leading edge of the avalanche's pressure wave hit him from the left. Not the main body, the displaced air and surface snow running ahead of the mass, and knocked him sideways off the trail into the slope to their right. He hit the slope going fast. He had a half-second of wrong orientation, the world tilting, and then his left side struck something hard under the snow. A rock, a ledge, something that had been a trail marker before the storm, and the impact went through his leg with a quality of wrongness that was unmistakable. He heard the bone, not a crack, more of a wet, muffled pop that he felt more in his stomach than his ears, followed immediately by a white-hot detonation of pain that started at mid-thigh and went everywhere at once. He stopped moving.
The slope had caught him against an outcropping that prevented him from sliding further. The main avalanche thundered past 20 feet to his left, close enough that the wind off it threw snow in his face, close enough that he could feel the ground vibrate under him. Then it was past. The roar faded down the mountain. The silence came back, bigger than before. He looked at his left leg. It was wrong. The angle was wrong. Not drastically wrong, not the nightmare of a compound break, but wrong enough. He could feel the specific wrongness of a structural failure in the bone, the way pain organized itself differently around something broken than around something merely damaged. He tried to stand. The leg refused in a way that was absolutely definitive. He made it to one knee, his right knee, and stayed there with his hands in the snow and his breath coming in the short, controlled intervals of a man managing serious pain. He heard footsteps behind him. She'd come back. Colt! Her voice had changed. All the careful flatness she used as a default register was gone. "Where are you hurt?" "Left leg," he said. "Mid-femur, maybe. Could be lower." He looked up at her. "It's broken." She didn't make a sound. She came down the slope to where he was and crouched beside him and looked at the leg with the same focused, practical attention she'd given everything else on this mountain. Not panicked, not theatrical, just reading the situation. "Can you put any weight on it?" "No." She put her hand on the thigh above the break, very gently, feeling through the trouser fabric. He felt her register the swelling that was already happening. Her jaw tightened, but her hands stayed steady. "We need to get you off this slope," she said. "Evelyn?" He said it the way you said something when you needed the other person to actually hear it. "You need to leave me here and get down the mountain." She looked at him. "I have a compass. I have 3 days of rations. I can build a shelter and—" "No," she said. "Listen to me. With this leg, I can't—" "No." She stood up. She was already looking around the slope, calculating, her eyes moving over the terrain with the expression of someone running numbers. "The line shack is about a mile back. Can you move if I help you?" "That's not—" "Can you move if I help you?" She said it again, not louder, but more precisely, like she was asking a technical question that required an honest technical answer. He looked at his leg. He looked at the mile of snow between them and the shack, at the broken terrain, at the post-storm surface that would not support him on one leg without sinking and without her. "Not fast," he said. "Then we go slow." She was already pulling at her pack, opening the side pocket where she kept her rope. "I'm going to rig something to support your left side. You put your weight on me and your right leg. We stop when we have to stop." "This is not Colt." She turned and looked at him, and he saw something in her face that was not stubbornness exactly, not the performance of determination that people put on when they were trying to believe their own will. It was something quieter and harder than that. "I'm not leaving you on a mountain with a broken leg. That's not something I'm going to do. So we can spend time arguing about it, or we can start moving, and every minute we stand here is a minute you're getting colder and that leg is getting worse." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the last 2 people he'd told to leave him, one in a bar fight in a different town, one in a different kind of trouble on a different mountain, years ago. Both times he'd won the argument. "All right," he said. It wasn't dignity exactly. It was arithmetic. The mile back to the line shack took 3 hours. He was not, it turned out, a good patient. He was too heavy for her to support comfortably, and his body's automatic response to the broken leg was a kind of muscular rigidity that fought against the irregular motion of mountain travel, which made every step a negotiation between what he needed to do and what the pain was telling him not to. He fell twice, not hard falls, controlled descents to one knee that she helped arrest. And both times he came back up without help because accepting help for the falling felt like one concession too many on top of all the other concessions the leg was forcing. She said very little during the 3 hours. She said step when they came to difficult ground and stop when she needed to readjust her grip. And once, when he went down the second time and stayed down a beat longer than the first time, she said his name in a way that wasn't a question but contained one. "I'm up," he said, and got up. The shack was as they'd left it. Fire cold, snow piled against the north wall from the storm, the bench still bearing the imprint of her sleeping figure in the worn wood. She got him through the door and onto the bench and started rebuilding the fire with the last of the stacked wood, working fast and efficiently, not wasting a movement. He sat and looked at his leg and did the arithmetic again and did not like the result any better than he had the first time. The leg needed to be splinted. The break wasn't compound, the skin was intact, which was the only good news. But the swelling was progressing and the bone needed immobilization before it did something worse. He'd splinted enough injuries in 20 years of mountain work to know what needed to happen. The problem was that doing it himself, to himself, one-handed in a cold room, was a different proposition from doing it to someone else. "You're going to have to do it," he said, when the fire was established and she'd come back to him. She looked at the leg. "I need you to tell me exactly how." He told her. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, organizing the information as it came in. She found the 2 straight sections of wood from the broken wall slat he'd identified, cut strips from the rope with his knife, and knelt beside him on the cold floor. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know. A lot. I know." She set the leg. He did not make a sound he was particularly proud of during the process, but he made it through, and when it was done and the splint was tied and she sat back on her heels with her hair in her face and her hands shaking slightly from the sustained effort of the last 20 minutes, the leg was stable and the worst of it was behind them. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said. "I didn't." Her voice was slightly unsteady. "You told me, and I did it. You did it well." She looked down at her hands, turned them over, looking at the rope burns from the line she'd used to help him down the slope, which he hadn't noticed her acquiring during the 3-hour walk and which she'd said nothing about. 4 distinct raw patches across her palms, already starting to blister. He reached out, without thinking much about it, and took her hand and looked at the damage. "You need to clean those," he said. "I know." She didn't pull her hand back. "I'll do it in a minute." They stayed like that for a moment, him holding her hand in his, both of them looking at the fire, both of them very aware of the 4 walls around them and the miles of mountain outside those walls, and the particular calculus of what they were and were not going to be able to do next. He released her hand. "The leg needs 2 weeks to be stable enough to climb on," he said. "I know. We have 3 days of rations, maybe 4. "I know that too." He looked at her. "So what do you want to do?" She looked at the fire for a long time, long enough that he thought she might be coming to the conclusion he'd expected her to come to at various points over the past 3 days. The rational conclusion, the survivable conclusion, the one that involved accepting what the mountain was telling them and going home. She said, "How far to the claim from here if you can't walk?" He went still. "That's not... How far?" He thought about it. He thought about the terrain between the shack and Widow's Cap. He thought about the alternate route, the one that was longer but lower, that avoided the ridge entirely and came at the eastern face from below, through the valley that most people didn't know about because it looked on a map like it dead-ended and only actually didn't if you knew the right way through. 3 days, he said slowly. "If you could manage a sled to move me through the low terrain, and if the valley route is clear, which it might be, because the storm load would have run down the upper couloirs, not the valley floor, can you make a sled out of what we have?" He looked at the shack's interior, the wooden wall slats, the rope, the canvas of the pack frames. He did construction in his head the way he'd been doing calculations all his life. Fast, practical, based on what was actually available rather than what would be ideal. "You could," he said. "Not me. I can tell you how, but building it is you." "Then tell me how." He looked at her for a long moment, at the rope burns on her palms, at the cut on her chin, at the knees she'd been favoring for 3 days without complaint, at the particular quality of her face in the firelight, not beautiful in the way the word usually got used, but real in a way that beauty didn't always manage to be. The mountain had taken everything he'd tested her with, and she was still here, kneeling on the floor of a cold room, asking him how to build a sled so she could drag a man with a broken leg 3 days through mountain snow toward a mine that might already have armed men waiting at it. He'd been wrong about her. He'd been wrong from the first moment in Harlan's store, and he'd been updating that assessment for 3 days, and now the update was complete and the original position was fully replaced. She wasn't what he'd expected. She wasn't what he'd planned for. She was something the mountain had produced from the material she'd arrived with, and what the mountain produced tended to be exactly what it looked like, and nothing else. He told her how to build the sled. She started on it that evening, working by firelight, cutting and lashing with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been given a problem and was treating it as the only thing in the world that currently mattered. He watched her from the bench and gave corrections when she needed them, and she took the corrections without pride and made the adjustments and kept working. By the time the fire burned low, the frame was done. Not elegant, rough-cut wood and rope lashing and a canvas base that would hold a man's weight if the snow was reasonably packed. But it would work. He knew it would work because he'd told her how, and she'd done exactly what he'd told her, and what he designed tended to do what it was designed to do. She put out the lamp and lay down and was asleep in under 3 minutes. He lay on the bench with his splinted leg elevated on his pack and the fire dying in the mountain quiet outside in the aftermath of its own violence. And he thought about the fact that he'd told her to leave him. He'd told her to leave him, and she'd said no without hesitation and without drama. The way you said no to something that wasn't a real option. He'd been telling people to go without him his whole life, mostly. It was a posture, a habit, the particular emotional efficiency of a man who'd decided long ago that needing people was a cost he couldn't afford on a mountain. You learned to be sufficient. You learned to calculate what you needed and carry it. He hadn't carried what was needed today. She'd brought it. He wasn't ready to name what he felt about that. He wasn't sure he had vocabulary for it, or that vocabulary was the right tool for whatever this was. He was just aware of it, a new weight in the room, sitting beside everything else, not going anywhere. Outside, the mountain was quiet under all its new snow. Inside, the fire went to coals and then to dark, and the cold pushed in at the edges. And Colt Maddox, who had survived everything the Blackstone Range had ever thrown at him without anyone's help, lay in the dark and felt the particular unfamiliar weight of being the person who got carried. He didn't sleep for a long time. When he did, it was without the confidence of a man who knew what came next. The fever came on the second night in the valley. Colt had known it was coming the way you knew a storm was coming. Not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of small ones. The heat building in his leg beneath the splint. The way his thoughts had started arriving slightly slower than usual, with a gap between intention and clarity that he recognized and didn't like. The sweat that was wrong for the temperature, wrong for the effort, wrong for everything except the specific wrongness of infection, finding a broken bone in a cold environment, and deciding to make something of the opportunity. He didn't tell Evelyn until the morning of day 2 in the valley, when she came back from checking the sled's lashing and found him shaking. She put her hand on his forehead, took it away, put it back, because apparently once wasn't enough information. "You're burning up," she said. "I know. How long?" "Started last night." She looked at him with an expression that had something complicated moving behind it. Not fear exactly, but a recalibration of what she was dealing with. He watched her do it. Watched her take the new variable and fit it into the structure of the problem she was solving. "I have willow bark in the medical kit," she said, "and something the pharmacist in Silver Ridge put in for fever. I didn't ask what it was." "The white powder packets," he said. "Use one." She got the kit and found them. Her hands were steady, which he noticed because his weren't entirely. The valley route had been the right call. 3 days of lower terrain, no technical climbing, a floor of packed snow that the sled crossed with the grinding, effortful progress of something that worked but not well. She'd been pulling him since morning of the first day out of the shack, stopping every hour to rest, eating while she walked when she could, adjusting the rope harness she'd rigged across her shoulders and chest when it cut into her. He'd offered commentary on the route from the sled, and she'd taken it without resentment, which was its own kind of grace. Being guided by a man you were physically hauling through a mountain valley was a situation that could have produced bitterness and didn't. She gave him the powder dissolved in water from her heated canteen. He drank it. It tasted like chalk and something vaguely chemical. "We're close," he said, "maybe 4 hours from the base of the eastern face. If the valley opens out the way I remember it, we'll see Widow's Cap before noon." "And the mine entrance?" "Your father's survey marks the main shaft on the lower eastern face, about 200 feet above the valley floor, accessible without technical gear in summer." He looked at the slope above them. "In these conditions, it's going to be a scramble. The snow on the face will be compressed from the storm, not deep. There were rock outcroppings that would have shed the load. Should be passable." "Can you climb it?" He thought about his leg, about what climbing meant on 200 feet of winter face with a broken femur splinted in wood and rope, about what was a reasonable and an unreasonable assessment of his own capabilities given his current condition. "I can move," he said, slowly, with something to lean on. She looked at him for a moment. That's not an answer. It's the honest one. She looked at the face above. She was quiet for a while. I need you to tell me the truth about something, she said. All right. If you can't make the climb, if the fever gets worse and you genuinely cannot move, she stopped, started again. Is there a way I can find the mine entrance from the survey map alone? Without you? He looked at her. She was asking a real question, not a hypothetical, not a way of making a point. She was actually asking because she needed to know, and she'd already factored in the possibility. Possibly, he said. Your father's survey is detailed. The landmark he used was a rock formation on the southeast corner of the face. He describes it as a double spire, 2 columns of granite about 30 feet high. The entrance is 40 feet due north of the left spire. She took out the map immediately. He watched her find it. He drew it, she said quietly. Right here. I thought it was just a notation. That's your landmark. She folded the map with the same care she always gave it. Thank you. You won't need it, he said. I'm going to make that climb. She looked at him again. He couldn't entirely tell if she believed him or if she was deciding to act as though she did, which amounted to the same thing for practical purposes. They started moving within the hour. The fever did not get better during the morning's travel, but it also didn't get dramatically worse, which Colt was treating as acceptable given the alternatives. His thinking stayed clear enough to read the valley and give her the route adjustments when she needed them. The cold actually helped in a perverse way. Kept his core temperature from climbing as high as it would have in a warm room, gave the medication something to work with. By mid-morning, he could see Widow's Cap. It rose above the valley's eastern end the way landmarks did when you'd been navigating toward them for days. Suddenly, fully, with an authority that made all the map reading feel like it had been pointing to a real thing all along. The hooked northern profile that Colt knew as the cap's signature shape, the dark rock faces scoured clean by the storm's wind, the lower eastern face in shadow at this hour, the double granite spires exactly where Edmund Mercer had drawn them 20-odd years ago. Evelyn stopped pulling. She stood in the snow with the sled rope across her shoulders and looked up at the peak her father had spent the better part of his life trying to reach, and she said nothing for a long time. He didn't say anything either. He let her have the moment, which seemed like the right instinct. It's real, she said finally. You thought it wasn't? A pause. Sometimes. In the middle of the night, in that shack with the storm outside, I thought, what if the survey is wrong? What if the mine doesn't exist? What if he was just a man who wanted very badly to believe in something and wrote it down convincingly? The mine's there, Colt said. How do you know? Because I know these mountains, and I know that rock formation, and I know what kind of geology produces a silver vein of the type your father described. The Blackstone Range has that geology in exactly the location he surveyed. He paused. I never said it to you before because you didn't ask, and because the mine existing doesn't change how hard the route was. She turned to look at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not the way faces shifted when they got good news, but the way a face shifted when something it had been bracing against stopped pressing. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He thought about it honestly. Because I was still testing you when it would have mattered. She held his gaze for a moment, then she turned back to Widow's Cap and said, Let's go. They were 400 yards from the base of the eastern face when Colt smelled the smoke. Not fire for warmth smoke. Not the thin camp smoke of someone keeping a travel fire going. This was the specific smell of a larger, more established setup. Sustained combustion, something that had been burning for hours or longer. Coming from the direction of the face. Stop, he said. She stopped. Turned. He was already working himself off the sled, which was a process that cost him, the leg making its position absolutely clear about any movement that asked something of it. He got upright, one hand on the sled frame, and looked toward the face. Someone's there, he said quietly. She looked at the face. She couldn't see what he was seeing, which was not a fire but the absence of one. The specific way smoke smell traveled in cold mountain air, and the particular direction this one was coming from, slightly south of the spires, which put the source at or very near the mine entrance. Blackwell's people, she said. Not a question. Almost certainly. She was quiet. He could see her working through it. The timeline, the filing pressure, the resources Blackwell had available that she didn't. If his people had come in from the north approach, which was technically harder but shorter from the nearest rail connection, they could have gotten here before the storm and waited it out. "How many do you think?" she asked. "Can't tell from this. 3, 4, maybe more." She looked at him. "And you have a rifle, which I can use from here, but not from up that face with this leg." He thought about it. "What I can do is set a position at the base. Use the rock cover. If you can get me to the right spot, I have angles on the approach to the entrance that would make anyone coming down that face very uncomfortable. And if they come down while I'm up there, then I make their day complicated." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see the calculation happening, the weighing of odds, the assessment of what they had against what was waiting for them. "I go up alone," she said. "To do what?" "To document. That's all I need. Photographs of the shaft, the survey markers, the vein if it's accessible. I have the camera in my pack, the survey documents, everything." She held up her hand before he could speak. "If Blackwell's people are at the entrance, I need to draw them away from it long enough to get in and get what I need." "That's not a plan. That's a wish." "I know. Do you have a better one?" He didn't. He went through the options as fast as the fever would let him think and came back to the same place each time. 2 people, one barely mobile, one without a weapon, against an unknown number of armed men with a head start and an established position. Frontal approach was suicidal. Retreat meant losing the mine and losing the legal battle and losing everything Evelyn had come up here for. "There's a lower approach," he said slowly. "Not on the face, below it, around the south side. There's a rock formation that runs parallel to the face about 100 feet below the entrance. Decent cover. If they've posted men, they'll be watching the valley approach and the direct line. The south side is harder, but they'll expect it less." She was already looking south. "Show me on the map." He showed her. She studied it for 2 minutes, asking 2 precise questions about the route, getting 2 precise answers. She folded the map. "Give me an hour," she said. "If I'm not back at the base of the face in 2 hours, leave without me." "I'm not Colt." The way she said his name had the same quality it had had in the line shack when she'd told him she wasn't leaving him on the mountain, flat and quiet and completely without negotiation. "You're sick. You need to get down. If I'm not back in 2 hours, it means something has gone very wrong and staying won't fix it. You take the rifle and you go." He looked at her. She was standing in front of him in the snow with rope burns on her palms and a healing cut on her chin and 3 days of mountain work written on every part of her. And she was making the rational argument, the same argument he would have made to anyone else in this situation, and the fact that he didn't want to accept it from her had nothing to do with whether it was right. 1 hour and a half, he said. 2. He set his jaw. 1:45. Something that wasn't quite a smile. Done. He found his position at the boulder field at the base of the face, a natural horseshoe of rock that gave him cover on 3 sides, and sight lines up the 2 most direct routes down from the entrance. The legs screamed at every movement getting there, but screaming was acceptable information, the kind that told you the damage was real without telling you anything you didn't already know. He got settled, the rifle across his knee, and watched Evelyn work her way south along the base of the face until the terrain folded and she disappeared. He checked the sky. The fever was making the light feel wrong, slightly too bright, slightly too sharp, the way things got when your temperature was high enough to affect your perception without being high enough to take your function. He knew this state. He'd worked in it before. It was manageable as long as you didn't pretend it wasn't happening. He watched the face. He watched the direct routes down. He counted minutes without a watch, using breath intervals the way he'd learned to in early mountain years before he'd had the money for a proper timepiece. At approximately 40 minutes, he heard voices on the face above. 2 men coming down the direct route. Not running. The methodical movement of men who were supposed to be watching something and had gotten bored watching nothing for 2 days and were coming down for coffee or warmth or a different piece of nothing to watch. Armed, he could see the rifles from this distance, slung rather than held, which told him they weren't alarmed yet. He put the rifle up. Let them come down far enough that they were committed to the route. Let them get to the point where the angle was clear and his cover was solid and the light was behind him. Then he put a round into the rock face 18 inches from the lead man's head. The sound cracked across the mountain and came back from the far valley wall and came back again, building and multiplying the way gunshots did in mountain terrain, making one shot sound like several from different positions. Both men went flat in the snow. One of them shouted something, a question or a curse. It was hard to tell from the distance. "Down rifles," Colt called. "Both of you. I've got 3 men on these slopes and I'm the worst shot of the group." He was alone and the fever was making him sweat in 20-degree cold, but the mountain was multiplying his voice the same way it had multiplied the shot, and men who went flat in the snow and couldn't see their target tended to believe what they were told. A long pause. Then one rifle came off a shoulder and was placed in the snow, then the other. "Hands where I see them," he called, "and don't look south." The last part was a mistake. Telling them not to do something put the idea in their heads, but neither of them looked south. They were busy looking at the boulder field trying to find the men who weren't there. He counted breaths. He watched the face above the 2 men for movement. He felt the fever work its way through his concentration like water through cracked stone, and he pushed back against it the way you pushed back against everything on a mountain, not by pretending it wasn't there, but by deciding it didn't get a vote in what happened next. At something close to 30 minutes, he heard scrambling above and south of him, the specific sound of someone moving fast on rock. And then Evelyn appeared around the south side of the face, coming down the lower route at a pace that was significantly faster than careful. She had her pack. She had the camera, a boxy, serious piece of equipment that her father had presumably bought when he was still a man who made serious investments, hung around her neck. She had something else, too, a canvas bag that hadn't been on her when she went up, bulging in a way that meant it had something in it. She reached the valley floor and crossed to him without looking at the 2 men pinned in the snow above, which was either tremendous nerve or the tunnel vision of someone running on pure focus. "I have it," she said. "We need to go." "What's in the bag?" "Ore samples and something else." She was already assessing his condition with her eyes. The fever, the leg, the rifle position. "Can you move?" "Yes." "Then move." He moved. Getting out was nothing like getting in. With Blackwell's 2 men pinned and the sled abandoned at the valley floor, and his leg operating at approximately 40% of what a leg should do, what followed was the most physically demanding thing he'd done since the avalanche. And the avalanche had included the specific disadvantage of surprise. They went south, away from the face, using the boulder cover, Evelyn taking his weight on her shoulder in the places where the terrain required something close to running. Behind them, he heard the 2 men on the face start moving again, their voices carrying down, louder now, angry, the paralysis of the first shot wearing off as they realized the numbers might not have been what they'd been told. Then he heard a third voice from higher up, closer to the entrance, giving orders, the flat practice authority of someone running this operation, not just employed by it. "How many were up there?" he said. 4. She didn't look back. 2 at the entrance, 2 down below. You had the 2 below. "And the entrance too?" "Inside when I came through. I was quiet." She glanced at the bag. "I didn't disturb anything they were doing. I found the original survey stakes in about 6 minutes and the vein in about 12. A pause. "Colt. The vein." He waited. My father wasn't imagining things. He told her that. Standing in the valley, looking at the cap, he told her the mine was real. But the way she said it now was different from hearing someone else confirm it. It was the particular quality of seeing a thing with your own eyes that no amount of prior confirmation could replace. "How big?" he asked. "I don't know how to read a vein. I know it was—" She stopped, started again. It was the whole back wall of the shaft, floor to ceiling, 20 feet across at minimum. He thought about what that meant in terms of grade and extraction and value, and then he stopped thinking about it because they were still moving and the men behind them were too. They cleared the boulder field and hit the valley floor, and she found the sled by instinct or memory, both probably. And for the second time in 3 days, she harnessed herself to it and started pulling, this time with him half upright alongside it, using his rifle as a walking stick, burning the last of what the fever had left him in reserve. Behind them, the voices on the face peaked and then faded. Not pursuing. He didn't know if it was because they'd lost the line, or because they'd assessed the odds and the orders and decided this particular day wasn't the day to find out how many men were in those boulders. He didn't look back to find out. Looking back was a mistake on every mountain he'd ever been on. They walked until this valley bent north and the face of Widow's Cap disappeared behind the ridgeline. And then they walked some more, and the fever put its hand on Colt's shoulder like something that had been patient and was done being patient. He didn't fall. He would have been very embarrassed to fall at this particular stage of things, which was not a noble reason to stay upright, but was a functional one. The light was changing, the low, long-angled light of late afternoon that meant hours until dark, and hours that they needed to use. Evelyn pulled. He walked. Between them, they moved through the cold, silent valley with the evidence of Edmund Mercer's life work in a canvas bag and a camera full of photographs that nobody had asked them to take any risks for except themselves. And the mountain watched them go the way it watched everything, without comment, without judgment, without any acknowledgement that what had just happened on its face was anything other than ordinary. It wasn't ordinary. Both of them knew that. Neither of them said it. There were some things the mountain didn't need to hear you say. The sled broke on the second day out of the valley. Not catastrophically. One of the main lashing points gave way where the rope had been under constant tension for too long and too much cold, and the whole left side of the frame dropped and dug into the snow and stopped everything with a lurch that nearly put Evelyn face first into the ground. She caught herself, turned, looked at the damage with the particular expression she'd developed over the past week for situations that were bad, but not yet catastrophic. A quick tightening around the eyes, a breath, then assessment. Colt was already looking at the break from his position on the sled. The fever had peaked the previous night and broken some time before dawn. He'd woken cold and soaked and clearer-headed than he'd been in 2 days, which was the specific relief of a crisis that had chosen to resolve itself rather than escalate. The leg was still a problem, would be a problem for weeks, but the fever going down meant he was back in the conversation in a way the fever had prevented. "Rope from the left side pack pocket," he said. "There's enough to relash if you double it." She was already reaching for it. It took 20 minutes to fix. Her hands were clumsy. Not from incompetence, but from cold and accumulated fatigue, the kind that built up in the small muscles of the hands and fingers over days of sustained physical work. He watched her work through the clumsiness without comment. She didn't need commentary. She needed to finish, and she did. "How far to the lower tree line?" she asked, straightening up. "Half a day if the snow stays packed." She nodded, shouldered the harness again, and started pulling. He watched the back of her head, the way she leaned into the harness, the particular set of her shoulders that he'd learned to read over 9 days on a mountain, what it looked like when she was at 70% capacity, what it looked like when she was running lower than that and compensating. Right now it was somewhere in the hard middle, the place where the body was doing what it was asked without any enthusiasm about the request. He was aware, lying on the sled she'd built from salvaged wood and rope, being pulled through the last miles of the Blackstone Range by a woman he'd expected to quit on day one, that the debt he owed her was not a thing he could calculate. You couldn't put a number on your life. He'd tried, in the long, fever-lit hours of the previous night, and the math kept coming out wrong because the math assumed a transaction, and this wasn't one. She hadn't saved him for money. She hadn't saved him for leverage or obligation or the performance of virtue. She'd saved him because leaving him on a mountain with a broken leg in January was not something she was going to do, and that was the whole of the reasoning. He understood that kind of person in theory. He'd just never been the one on the receiving end of it. They reached the tree line by mid-afternoon. The change was physical. The wind dropped. The temperature came up by something measurable. And the quality of the silence shifted from the absolute zero of open mountain to the layered quiet of trees which had birds in it, and the small sounds of snow falling from branches, and the sense of a world that contained living things besides the two of them and their calculations. Evelyn stopped at the first substantial tree and leaned her forehead against the bark for about 10 seconds. He didn't say anything. She pushed off and kept moving. They reached the lower trail by dark and made camp in a hollow with a decent windbreak and enough deadfall wood for a fire that was genuinely warm, not just technically burning. He cooked, insisted on it from the ground, one-handed, because there were things he could still do, and he was going to do them. The result was better than anything they'd eaten since the first night out of Silver Ridge, which was not a high bar but cleared it. She ate without speaking for a while. "The photographs," he said. "Are they usable?" "Yes." She'd checked them twice since leaving Widow's Cap, carefully unwrapping the camera
examining the settings, going through the documentation in her head. I have 12 exposures. The survey markers in 4 of them, clear, with the original claim numbers visible. The vein in 3. The shaft itself. She paused. And the evidence that someone else had been using that shaft recently. Equipment that wasn't my father's, recent fire ash, a crate with a supplier's mark on it. Blackwell's supply mark? His subsidiaries, a company called Irongate Extraction. She said the name with the flat certainty of someone who'd done their research. They're in 3 of the photographs. Colt looked at the fire. That's not just documentation of your father's claim. That's evidence of trespass. And potentially fraudulent filing. If they've been actively using a claim they simultaneously argue is abandoned. She stopped. It's what my lawyer called a gift. The kind that makes the other side's case fall apart in front of a judge. If you get it to a judge Blackwell doesn't own, Judge Harmon in the territorial court hasn't taken Blackwell's money. My father's lawyer verified that before we left. She looked at the fire. Everything depends on getting to Harmon before Blackwell's people get back down the mountain and put pressure on anyone they can reach. He thought about the 2 men on the face. How long it would take them to get down by the northern approach. How long to reach a telegraph line? How long for Blackwell to mobilize whatever he could mobilize in response? The timeline was tight. It had been tight since Denver, and it had gotten tighter with every day the storm had added to their journey. How many more days to Silver Ridge, she asked. 2, maybe less if the lower trail is clear. He looked at his leg. I can't move fast. I know. She looked at the fire. Colt, I need you to tell me honestly, can we make it in less than 2 days if I push? He thought about it. The lower trail was mostly flat. The sled would work better on the packed surface. His leg, with the splint and his weight on a sled rather than his feet, was a logistical problem rather than a moving one. The variables were her capacity and the trail condition. Push hard. We might do it in a day and a half, he said. Then that's what we do. She banked the fire and was asleep before he'd finished the thought he'd been forming about saying something, about the specific thing he'd been turning over for 2 days in the way of a man who rarely said anything he hadn't finished thinking about. He let it sit. There would be time, or there wouldn't, and either way she was asleep, and the mountain wasn't the place for it. They pushed hard. A day and 4 hours after leaving the tree-line camp, the brown smudge of Silver Ridge appeared in the valley below them, and Evelyn Mercer pulled Colt Maddox off the last slope of the Blackstone Range and into the edge of town on a sled she'd built with her own hands. And if anyone who saw them arrive thought it was a strange sight, they kept the thought to themselves because strange sights were not uncommon in Silver Ridge, and people who came off those mountains alive looked however they looked. Doc Waverly set the leg properly that afternoon, a process that Colt endured with a silence that cost him something, and confirmed that the splint had held the bone in reasonable alignment, and that the infection, while it had done some damage, had not done the worst damage it could have. You're going to be on a crutch for 6 weeks minimum, Waverly said. 4, Colt said. Waverly looked at him over his glasses. 6. Evelyn was already at the telegraph office. She sent 3 telegrams in 40 minutes, one to her father's lawyer in Denver, one to a newspaper correspondent she'd contacted before leaving the city, one to Judge Harmon's clerk in the territorial capital. The telegrams were precise and sequenced, each one timed to arrive before the next, each one containing exactly as much information as that recipient needed, and nothing that could be used against her if intercepted. She'd planned this part from Denver, long before she'd stepped off the stage in Silver Ridge, long before she'd shaken Colt's hand in Harlan's store. She'd known that getting to the mine was only half of it. The other half was what you did with what you found once you got back, and the speed with which you did it before the other side could adjust. The legal proceedings that followed were not quick. Nothing involving Victor Blackwell was quick, because Blackwell had enough money and enough lawyers and enough patience to make anything take longer than it should. But they were, in the end, conclusive. The photographs held. The ore samples, analyzed by 2 independent assayers, both of whom produced results that made the room go quiet when read aloud, confirmed the vein's existence and its scale. The iron gate extraction equipment documented in the photographs matched purchase records that Evelyn's lawyer, a thorough man named Cassius Webb, had quietly obtained during the weeks she'd been on the mountain. The survey markers, verified by a territorial surveyor who drove up from the capital,
and spent 3 days on the mountain with her photographs as his guide, matched Edmund Mercer's original filing exactly. And Blackwell's people's presence in the shaft, active, operational, using equipment they'd brought in before the storm, turned the boundary dispute into something worse for Blackwell's side. Trespass, fraudulent filing, attempted theft of a legitimate claim through legal manipulation. Judge Harmon had a long memory for the Farrell case, even if he'd never been able to do anything about it. And when the evidence arrived in his courtroom, he did what judges with long memories and clean hands occasionally got the opportunity to do. He ruled completely in Evelyn's favor. Blackwell's lawyers appealed. The appeal took 4 months and failed. They filed a second challenge on different grounds. It took 6 months and also failed. At some point during the second challenge, something shifted in Blackwell's own situation. A larger financial problem, a federal inquiry into some of his rail dealings that had nothing to do with Evelyn, but consumed the attention and resources he'd been directing at her case. And the opposition to the Mercer claim became a problem he stopped spending money on. Evelyn had won before that happened, but the silence afterward, the absence of the pressure she'd been living under for 4 months before Silver Ridge, and 10 days on a mountain, and another year in courtrooms, that silence arrived in stages, and each stage felt different, and the last one felt like being able to take a full breath for the first time in a very long while. Colt's leg took 8 weeks, not 6. Not 4 either, which he never acknowledged. He spent most of those weeks in Silver Ridge, which he'd never done for that long in the years he'd been operating out of the town. Always moving, always coming back to resupply and then going again, treating Silver Ridge as a transit point rather than a place. Being stationary in it was a different experience than he'd expected. The town had a shape when you stayed in it. People had names. Harlan, it turned out, was a more interesting man than his tin shelves suggested. Evelyn stayed too. She had reasons. The legal proceedings required her presence, and the practical work of organizing what the mine's development would look like required being closer to the territory than Denver allowed. She took a room at the boarding house and set up a working correspondence with Webb and with a mining engineer she'd retained from a reputable firm in San Francisco. She was, in the way she was with everything, systematic and thorough and not interested in moving faster than the situation warranted or slower than it could bear. He saw her most days, sometimes by design, sometimes by the natural collision of two people living in a town the size of Silver Ridge. They talked, actually talked, not the terrain and logistics exchange of the mountain, but conversation that had room in it, that went places it hadn't started out going. He found out that she'd learned to ride when she was 6 and hadn't stopped until her father's illness made the habit impractical. He found out she read engineering journals the way other people read novels. He found out she had a dry humor that she kept quiet, that came out sideways in observations she delivered without changing her expression, and that once you'd noticed it, you started watching for it. She found out things about him too. He didn't plan for that exactly, but it happened the way things happened when you spent enough time in proximity to someone who listened as well as she did. She found out about the brother he'd had and lost 20 years ago in a mountain accident that was half chance and half a decision Colt had made and would have made differently if he'd known what differently looked like. She found out that the reason he'd gone into guiding rather than the trapping or mining that other men in his position chose was that he'd discovered he liked knowing the mountain better than it knew him, that the specific pleasure of competence in a hostile environment was the closest thing to contentment he'd found. She listened to all of it without trying to fix any of it, which was more than most people managed. One evening in late March, 6 weeks after they'd come off the mountain, they were sitting on the steps of Harlan's store in the last thin light of a day that had been warm enough to hint that the world was going to be something other than frozen forever. The mud on Silver Ridge's main street had that particular late winter quality of being almost manageable. "The mining engineer comes next week," she said. "I know. You told me. He's going to want to see the approach routes, the valley access." She paused. "I told him I had someone who knew the terrain." He looked at her. "That's presuming something," he said. "Yes." She didn't look at him. She was watching the end of the street where the mountain road disappeared into the tree line. "I'm aware that it's presuming something. You can say no." He thought about it. He thought about the valley route and the southern approach to Widow's Cap and the specific quality of the eastern face in the morning light when the ice on the rock caught the low winter sun. He thought about 4 months of Silver Ridge, which had been more tolerable than he'd expected, but was starting to develop a ceiling. "What would the work look like?" he said.
"Route assessment for the mining operation, guidance for the survey teams going in and out, seasonal. You'd be free in the winters." She paused. "Possibly not the deep winters, given what you've told me about the upper approaches." "I told you that on a mountain. The context was specific. The information seems generally applicable." He was quiet for a moment.
There was something he'd been carrying since the valley, since the sled and the fever and the way she'd said no in the line shack when he'd told her to leave, and the way her face had looked in the firelight on the last night on the mountain when she'd said it's real about the mine and meant something larger than silver. He'd been carrying it the way you carried something you hadn't found the right place to put down yet. He looked at her profile, at the cut on her chin, which had healed to a thin scar that she showed no interest in lamenting. At the hands in her lap, the rope burn marks faded to silver lines across the palms. "The route assessment," he said. "That's not the only reason you're asking." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "it's not." The last of the light went off the mountain road. In the blue dusk, Silver Ridge made its ordinary sounds. A door somewhere, a horse, the distant metal sound of something being worked at in a shed. Ordinary sounds of a place that had no idea what was happening on its general store steps. "I'm not easy to work with," he said. "I'm aware. I've worked with you. I don't—" He stopped, started again. "I'm better at mountains than I am at most other things." "I know that too." She finally looked at him. Her eyes in the dusk were the same steady brown they'd been in Harlan's store on the first day, when she'd put the envelope on the counter and told him she wasn't asking him to believe in her. "I'm not asking you to be something different from what you are. I'm asking if what you are wants to stay." He held her gaze. The mountain was up there in the dark behind the tree line, always up there. He'd spent 20 years letting it be the main thing, the organizing fact of his existence, the thing that justified not needing anything the valley offered. He'd been right about it, in a way. The mountain had given him what he'd needed and asked only competence in return, which was a fair deal and an honest one. What was sitting on the steps of Harlan's general store in late March asking him if he wanted to stay was not the mountain, and it was not asking for only competence. It was asking for whatever came after the mountain, whatever a man had left when the thing that had organized his life changed shape. He thought about what he had left. He thought about who had been there when the mountain tried to collect on 20 years of debt, and what she'd done with her hands and her rope, and the hours she'd spent pulling a sled through a valley while he lay on it burning with fever, and the fact that she had never once acted like it made her something he owed. "The route assessment," he said finally. "When does it start?" She understood what he meant. He could tell by the way the tension in her shoulders released slightly. Not dramatically, not with theater, just a small yielding, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. "Whenever you're ready," she said. He nodded. They sat on the steps until the dark was complete and Silver Ridge lit its lamps, and the mountain stood behind the tree line where it always stood, patient and permanent and absolutely indifferent to the small human business being conducted at its feet. It didn't need to know what they'd decided. It had already done what it was going to do. Asked the question it always asked, which was not about silver or survival or legal claims, but about what a person was made of when the comfortable version of themselves ran out. Evelyn Mercer had answered that question on a ridge in January, in a line shack in a blizzard, on a slope below an avalanche, on the face of Widow's Cap with 4 armed men 50 feet above her. Colt Maddox had answered it differently, not on the mountain, but here, on these steps, in the ordinary dark of a March evening, by deciding that needing something was not the same as being weakened by it. The mine became operational the following summer. The first ore cart came out of the eastern shaft on a Tuesday in June, unremarkable in itself, just rock and metal and the labor of men who'd been hired and trained and given a fair wage, which was not how Blackwell had run his operations and was deliberately how Evelyn ran hers. She was present for it. So was Colt, standing without a crutch for the first time in months, watching the cart emerge from the shaft, with the same expression he'd had watching her cross the ridge in the blizzard. Not quite surprised, but the look of someone confirming something they'd already decided was true. Silver Ridge changed over the years that followed. Not overnight. Places didn't change overnight, and anyone who told you different was selling something. It changed the way real things changed, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and bad seasons and problems that took longer to solve than they should have. But the mine brought money, and money brought people. And people brought the ordinary complications of a community that had decided to be a community rather than a way station. Evelyn built what her father had imagined but never reached. Not just a mine, but an operation, a system, something that employed people rather than consuming them. Colt guided the survey teams through the mountains, and when the survey teams didn't need him, he guided other people through other mountains, because the mountain was still the mountain, and his relationship with it wasn't transferable. And he wasn't the kind of man who stopped being what he was because his life had changed shape. They married quietly on a Wednesday, in the office of the same judge who'd ruled in Evelyn's favor. Not because they were private people exactly, but because the event itself felt private, like something that had already happened on a mountain and was only being formalized now in the valley. Harlan attended. He cried, which surprised everyone, including himself. There was a photograph from that day. Nothing fancy. A local man with a camera and a reasonable eye, two people standing in front of the territorial courthouse in the March cold, not arranged so much as simply standing next to each other. She had her hand in the crook of his arm. He was looking at the camera with the particular expression of a man who has been wrong about something important and has made his peace with how wrong he was. She was looking at him. The mountain was in the background, visible over the rooftop, the Blackstone Range in its permanent winter white, exactly what it had always been and would go on being long after every person in the photograph was gone. It didn't have an opinion about any of it. It had never promised anyone anything. What people found up there, they found in themselves. That had always been the only thing on offer.